On November 6 of 1900, the murdered body of a 19-year-old white woman named Pearl Forbes was found in a Leavenworth ravine. This further heightened local whites' outrage over rumors that black men had been raping local white women. Although the local PD were working under the assumption that Pearl Forbes had been killed in a robbery gone bad, and the medical examiner showed that she had not been sexually assaulted. The coroner's report declared that she had been strangled with the purpose of rape. Local newspapers further fanned the flames by running sensationalist reports that a predator had stalked Pearl Forbes, forced her down a ravine, outraged her, and then killed her. As fears of a black sexual predator on the loose reached fevered pitch, Spanish-American War veteran Fred Alexander was accused of assaulting a different white woman. And before those allegations could even be investigated, authorities charged him with the murder of Pearl Forbes. 4 days, a mob of thousands stalked Fred Alexander as he was transferred from jail to jail. Fred Alexander refused to confess, but the local press, determined to fuel the mob's rage, printed unsupported reports that Alexander and a group of black men had choked Pearl Forbes, carried her to a shanty, and took turns raping her. A vigilante mob decided that Fred Alexander needed to be lynched. The local officials cooperated with the mob, posting official announcements of the lynching all over the city. And when that time arrived, the mob broke into the jail, attacked Fred Alexander with a hatchet before dragging him out of his cell. Participants mutilated the body of Fred Alexander, castrating him most likely while he was still alive, and took body parts as souvenirs. The mob took the man to the same ravine where Pearl Forbes had been found, chained him to an iron stake, doused him with gasoline, and set him on fire before a crowd. Welcome to One Mic, a Black History podcast, the show that brings you untold stories of Black history. I'm your host, Country Boy, and today we're talking about Black veterans, specifically after Reconstruction to the end of World War I. As always, if you like this, you enjoy this, please consider donating to our Patreon page and review us on Apple Podcasts. Also, listen to The Cut. We're here for all of your Black culture needs. The enslavement of African Americans in the United States built wealth and prosperity for white Americans, but at the same time assigned Black people to chains and servitude and created the idea of racial inferiority, a belief that Black people were naturally and permanently inferior to whites, and created the powerful idea that is still rooted in a lot of people's minds. Blacks always looked at military service as a way to achieve racial equality and to douse the idea of racial inferiority. The idea of donning a military uniform and fighting for democracy to earn respect and decency conflicted with the very status of Black people in America. Black servicemen staked their claim on freedom and equality on military service. Fighting for democracy was key to a better life that African Americans desired, and by serving their country, Black veterans displayed their commitment to the country's values. In the face of a constant message of racial hierarchy, and despite not being recognized as full citizens in America, many Blacks fought for the United States for the idea that conditions would get better, but instead, Black soldiers who served in the armed forces from the Civil War to the end of World War II only faced racial terror, violence, and hatred, and especially during peacetime. White Americans feared that Black veterans asserting and demanding equality would disrupt the social order built on white supremacy and destroy the economic order of things. They feared that Black veterans would believe they were equal to whites and worth more than poverty, poor education, and unskilled jobs. The South in particular feared that an independent black veteran would lead other African Americans, especially in the South, to challenge racial segregation that the South was built on. Black veterans trained in weapons and combat were felt to be a threat to use those new skills at home. Black veterans were the physical representation of white fears of a black population that outright rejected its place in the racial hierarchy. The determination of black veterans seeking equality following their military service clashed with the determination of white Americans who wanted to continue white supremacy. This tension made black servicemen special targets for discrimination, mistreatment, and violence. The persecution of black veterans is important to understanding racial violence against African Americans as a whole. From the end of Reconstruction until years after World War II, thousands of black veterans were accosted, beaten, and attacked, and some were lynched. Civil rights leader and black veteran Hosa Williams enlisted in World War II. During the Battle of France, an artillery shell hit Williams' platoon, killing 12 soldiers and wounding Williams. While transporting Williams to the hospital, his ambulance was also hit with an artillery shell. Mr. Williams, again, the only survivor, spent 13 months recovering from his injuries in a British hospital. Once arriving home to America, Williams attempted to drink out of a white-only drinking fountain at a bus station in Americus, Georgia, when he was brutally assaulted by a white mob and left for dead. He spent another 8 weeks recovering in a Veterans Administration hospital. He would later state that he fought in World War II, was captured by the German army, and I want to tell you that Germans were never as inhumane as the state troopers in the state of Alabama. Following a brief period after President Lincoln's assassination, the federal government gave up on Reconstruction and left the South, abandoning newly freed African Americans and failing to enforce their new citizenship. A system of convict leasing and sharecropping followed. Blacks quickly returned to the status very similar to slavery. President Andrew Johnson, who took office following Lincoln's assassination, adopted views and policies that opposed black voting rights, restored Confederate citizenship, and basically allowed Southern former Confederates to reestablish white supremacy and dominate black people with almost total impunity. Black Civil War veterans were seen as a particularly strong threat to the racial hierarchy. They were early targets for discrimination by state laws called black codes. Some states completely eliminated black gun ownership, which had reached unprecedented levels during the war due to black military service. States including Alabama, Florida, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi passed laws that made it a crime for African Americans to possess firearms. Florida created a law prohibiting black people from possessing any Bowie knife, dirk, sword, firearm, or ammunition of any kind, and made such violations punishable by a public whipping. Mississippi's Black Code wrote, "No freeman, free Negro, or mulatto not in military service of the United States government and not licensed to do so by the Board of Police in his or her county shall keep a firearm of any kind or any ammunition, a dirk, or a Bowie knife." Whites, of course, were free to own firearms, and in some states, police were stationed at police stations ready to seize black veterans' weapons as they arrived. Black veterans who didn't comply were beaten and many were shot. Southern papers would fuel fears of black veterans by publishing sensationalist articles about conflicts between supposed innocent white police and drunk armed black soldiers with the only intent on starting trouble. In 1866, after a race riot known as the Memphis Massacre, the Memphis Argus published an editorial blaming the massacre on black gun ownership. The paper wrote, "Again, the reprehensible conflict of races broke out in our midst, and again our streets are stained with blood. At this time, there can be no mistake about it. The blame for this tragic and bloody riot lies, as usual, with the poor, ignorant, deluded blacks. who have so often shown themselves utterly unfit to be trusted with firearms. On this occasion, the facts all go to show that but for the much abused privilege, according to them, by misguided, misjudged friends, that there would be no riot. The universal questions asked on all corners of the streets is, why are Negroes not disarmed? As Southerners complained about African Americans' access to weapons, Southern state legislators pressed to disarm African Americans at the very same time when Black veterans needed the most protection. In 1868, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, told Congress that Black soldiers in Kentucky, having served under the Union Army, were special objects of persecution. And in hundreds of instances, they've been driven from their homes. Numerous Blacks have been threatened, beaten, and whipped merely for attempting to rebuild their lives after war. In Bardstown, Kentucky, a mob lynched a United States Colored Troops veteran. The mob stripped him of his clothes, beat him, cut off his sexual organs, forced him to run half a mile to a bridge outside of town where he was killed. The terror inflicted on Black veterans by Southern whites served to perpetuate the racial caste system and maintain the power in the hands of whites after the defeat of the Confederacy. In the years leading up to World War I, African Americans were nearly 50 years out of slavery, but still right in the middle of racial terror. In 1910, approximately 90% of Blacks still lived in the South. That's almost 7 million African Americans, and they faced a daily threat of injury and death at the hands of a white person and were still without the enjoyment of full citizenship. As we spoke about in episode 2 about the Harlem Hellfighters, the result was African Americans were extremely divided about their support of the war effort. The message at the time was that America was joining the war to make the world safe for democracy. But for African Americans, still being terrorized and being denied their constitutional rights, this message didn't mean much. African American leaders were split on joining the war effort. Activist A. Philip Randolph was not optimistic that participating in the war effort would improve the lives of Black people. Black folks had sacrificed every American war since the Revolution, and yet we have yet to receive full citizenship. In contrast, W.E.B. Du Bois advertised to the Black community that while the war lasts, Blacks should forget our special grievances and grow closer in the ranks, shoulder to shoulder with our fellow white citizens and allied nations that are fighting for democracy. Black servicemen were especially established in the military by the time World War I started. Few held any leadership or combat positions. Majority of Black soldiers were assigned to labor as stevedores and built roads, bridges, and railways and dug trenches on the front line. While this work was essential to the war effort, many asked, when would I see combat? When Black soldiers were given the chance, they fought heroically. Their bravery was widely celebrated for a tiny moment by the entire nation. I spoke more in depth about the 369th Infantry and Private Henry Johnson, the pride of the American military during World War I, in episode 2, the Harlem Hellfighters. The 369th was attached to the French military and saw 191 days of combat, more than any other American regiment. And Private Henry Johnson was awarded the Croix de Guerre, the French's highest award for valor. Recently, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, which is the highest, most prestigious personal military decoration in the United States military. Now, the soldiers of the 369th were assigned to work for the French military. Their experience was completely different from other Black soldiers. Black regiments like the 366 stayed attached to the United States military during World War I and faced constant hostility and a leadership that was vehemently opposed to them seeing combat. Black veterans challenged racial stereotypes of Black men in combat by fighting with courage and pride. Returning home, Black veterans were met with a similar violence and white supremacy. Their status as veterans, once again, made them special targets for aggression Even Private Johnson, who was Sergeant Johnson at this time, came home almost completely disabled and was subject to racial discrimination and denied his veteran benefits and medical care. When he publicly objected to the mistreatment of black soldiers, he was discharged from the military and died in poverty at the age of 32. Military, although segregated and still filled with racial tension and discrimination, at least offered hope, economic mobility. But as soldiers returned home, even in Congress, the fear of the returning black soldier posed such a threat to social hierarchy in the South that they made it a matter of record. In 1917, Mississippi Senator James K. Vardaman spoke on the floor of the United States Senate, warning about the reintroduction of black soldiers into the South will inevitably lead to disaster. For Vardaman and others like him, black soldiers' patriotism was seen as a threat, not a virtue. Vardaman stated, impress the Negro with the fact that he is defending the flag, inflate his untutored soul with military airs, teach him that it is his duty to keep that emblem of the nation flying triumphantly in the air. But it is only a short step to the conclusion that his political rights must be respected. White Americans feared that meeting the demands of black veterans for respect would lead to African Americans demanding better working conditions, higher wages, and would encourage African Americans to resist Jim Crow and racial oppression. Black veterans' experience with firearms in combat only escalated fears of a black rebellion. In addition, the stereotype that black men were chronic rapists of white women was only amplified by wartime liaisons between black troops and white French women. By being accepted by French women, whites felt that it would give black veterans the idea that they had sexual access to Southern white women. So as soldiers returned home to enjoy peacetime, many white Southerners were literally preparing for a war. World War I was much a broken promise for black veterans. They had gone and risked their life for a war that was supposed to make the world safe. And then they came home to a country that was still going to deny African Americans equality and basic human decency. It was even risky for black servicemen to wear their uniforms in the South. Many whites interpreted this as an act of defiance. There were several accounts of whites in the South accosting black veterans, attempting to strip them of their uniforms. Black veteran Eli Green, only 3 months after returning home from World War I, was wearing his Army uniform when he was driving downtown Waxahachie, Texas, when the sheriff deputy threatened to rip the uniform off him. The sheriff and 3 other officers ripped Eli Green from his car, dragged him for half a block, beat him with their fists and the barrels of their service revolvers, while other men watched, had every intention of shooting and killing Eli Green on that day. And the only thing that stopped them was that a prominent white man who knew Eli Green drove by and intervened, saving his life. Now, Eli Green survived this attack and managed to leave the South, but there were other veterans who did not. On December 27th of 1919, officers transporting veteran Powell Green to a jail in Raleigh, North Carolina, when they were overpowered by a mob. Powell Green, who had been accused of shooting a white officer in a movie theater in Franklinton, North Carolina. The mob tied a rope around Green's neck, dragged him for 2 miles, then hung him from a nearby pine tree. These public spectacles of lynching were designed to terrorize and intimidate the entire African American community by torturing and mutilating victims in front of massive crowds. They succeeded in horrifying and traumatizing generations of African Americans. Lynchings and general racial oppression fueled a massive exodus out of the South to northern industrial cities in what was known as the Great Migration. From 1910 to 1940, almost 1.5 million African Americans and black veterans migrated to the North. They were sold on the idea of a better life and escape from a racial hierarchy that had dictated every aspect of their life. But even in northern cities, countless African American veterans assaulted, were beaten, incidents of racial violence. At least 13 veterans were lynched during the violent clashes of the Red Summer. The Red Summer was built on massive anxiety of jobs and housing and an economic downturn, and turned into massive violence in America. Between April and November of 1919, there will be approximately 25 riots and instances of mob violence. Black veterans were not as inclined to take this abuse. Across the country, former soldiers used their government-provided training and weapons to defend their neighborhoods against vicious white mobs. Black people formed self-defense militias to try to stop white people from terrorizing their homes, their neighborhoods, and protect their families when the police wouldn't. During the Chicago riot of 1919, some veterans broke into an armory and stole weapons. Some of those veterans had even seen combat and were very capable of protecting themselves using violence. So when they encountered the white mob, they were extremely shocked by any resistance. As bloodshed spread through South Carolina, Nebraska, Florida, Ohio, blacks around the country took inspiration to the actions of black soldiers in Washington, D.C. and Chicago, and they attempted to follow suit. In a riot in Charleston, South Carolina, one black man reportedly said of the black self-defense militia, "Males carried themselves with as much calmness as if they were going to shoot a rabbit on a hunt or going to shoot one of the Kaiser's soldiers." There was a permanent shift in the way black people responded to white violence in the United States, and increasingly they were using self-defense tactics, including black veterans mobilizing against mob violence. And for black people, the way black veterans responded to the bloodshed added just a bit of inspiration to the terror of the Red Summer. The immediate decade post-war saw very little changes in social, political, and economic status of black veterans, no matter where they resided in the United States. Despite their hopes, their service, their sacrifice, and their bravery, black veterans failed to secure full citizenship. Yet, 1.5 million black men enlisted in the military to fight during the Second World War. Once again, they displayed their commitment and faith to American democracy. Despite overwhelming injustice and horrific attacks against black veterans during the era of racial terror, they remained determined to fight abroad as well as at home in the name of democracy, led to inspire larger segments of the black community to participate in social activism that was to deal a major blow to America's system of segregation and oppression. Thank you for listening tonight. I'm your host, Country Boy, and this is One Mic, a Black History podcast. Once again, if you enjoyed this, you like this, please consider donating to my Patreon page, review us on Apple Podcasts. Lastly, before we go, listen to the Cut Podcast for all your black culture needs. And peace.